When it comes to clinical psychology, France is stuck somewhere in the 1950s. Proof of this haughty ignorance and truculence is in the fact that the phrase or the term perverse narcissism or the narcissistic pervert or some variation thereof is very common in the discourse of psychoanalysis and psychology and the media in France. Perverse narcissism has been soundly and resoundingly rejected by every clinical authority worldwide, with the only exception being France. And there are good reasons to reject this construct. Today, I will use this video to delve deeper into Racamier's idea of narcissistic perversion and why it is wrong and, to some extent, ignorant. But before we go there, yesterday I have had the pleasure of talking to a documentary filmmaker and his assistant from France, TV Monde, I think. And they're making a documentary about financial fraud, con artists, con men, swindlers, scammers, and so on and so forth, with emphasis on the psychology of these people, and even more importantly, the psychology of the victims. Now, they were under the impression that I am a medical doctor. I am not a licensed or practicing physician, or that I'm a clinician. And I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I am a professor of clinical psychology. I teach psychology. I do not treat patients. I don't work with patients. Now, I'm saying all this because this is exactly what they're looking for. So, if you have been the victim of financial fraud and abuse, or if you as a clinician have had the opportunity to work with such a victim, please contact me and I will put you in touch with the documentary filmmakers. Of course, on condition that you're willing to appear in such a documentary. Okay? So write to me at samvaknin@gmail.com, samvaknin@gmail.com, and I will forward your emails to the documentary filmmakers in France. My name is Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and as I've already mentioned like 9 times, I'm a professor of psychology, not a physician, and not a clinician. Okay? Here we go. A year ago, only a year ago, a book was published by Routledge, which is a very respectable academic publisher. The book is titled The Narcissistic Perversion. The author is Hila Yahalom, and the subtitle is A Psychoanalytic Reflection on Narcissistic Parenthood and its Ramifications. And here is what the abstract says of one of the chapters which deals with narcissistic perversion. This chapter introduces the argument that narcissism and perversion are 2 sides of the same coin, and that a severe narcissistic pathology will always be accompanied by a perverted misuse of others. The perversion at hand is a perversion of the personality, and only in the extreme cases, a sexual perversion. But the experience of the victim is that of an emotional violation. It is a perversion that both denies and accepts reality at the same time, a retreat from both the schizoparanoid position and the depressive position, and a defense against depression and annihilation anxieties. The perversion is a derivative of a pathological object relations involving surplus projective identification. It also manifests as a sadomasochistic relationship, the narcissist deriving satisfaction from pressing himself and his inner world into the object, omnipotently controlling them whilst denying separateness. The object might develop a concomitant masochistic perversion. So the object might develop a masochistic perversion, having internalized the abuse as the only way to be related to. The chapter reviews different theories about perversion and writings relating perversions to narcissistic pathology. Mr. Z. Kohut's work is discussed as an example of a sadomasochistic relationship between a narcissistic mother and her son, resulting in the son's developing a masochistic perversion. What is she talking about? What on earth has perversion got to do with narcissism? To understand this connection, or this alleged connection, we have to resort to the work of the French psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Paul-Claude Racamier, R-A-C-A-M-I-E-R, Paul-Claude Racamier. He did his work in psychopathology. Racamier suggested that narcissistic perversion is not a type of personality, but a relational pathology, and that it consisted of a deconstruction or destructuring of the personality in which the notion of otherness does not exist. In other words, there's no recognition of the separateness and externality of the other, an othering failure in my language. Now, this is all very interesting, but this is exactly what the object relations schools have been saying in the 1960s in the United Kingdom. People like Winnicott, Fairbairn, Guntrip, and many others. Heretofore, there's nothing new. It's very common in psychology for people who seek fame and celebrity and recognition to simply rename something, rediscover it, and then claim credit for it. The notions of narcissistic perversion and narcissistic pervert are now very popular in the French media. They don't actually use the Anglo-Saxon terms of narcissistic personality disorder and malignant narcissist or psychopathic narcissist. They use narcissistic pervert. But the scientific community worldwide, with the exception of France, has, as I said, completely rejected this idea for reasons that I will discuss in a few minutes. It makes no appearance in any diagnostic manual, be it the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the ICD, International Classification of Diseases. And very often, narcissistic perversion is now conflated with psychopathy, so that it refers to a kind of narcissist who is also a criminal in some way, or perverted in a sexual way. There's been a corruption of this phrase of narcissistic perversion, and the corruption is well justified, because the use of the word perversion perverts its meaning. The only perversion in narcissistic perversion is the perversion of the word perversion, as we will see. Racamier suggested this whole concoction in 1986 in a paper. He suggested that it is a particular type of perversion, and then in 1987 and in 1992, and then in his book, The Genius of Origins, he explained the narcissistic perverse movement is essentially defined as an organized way of defending oneself from all internal pain and contradiction and expelling them to brood otherwise, while overvaluing oneself, all at the expense of others. And it is this element, the expense of others, which constitutes, according to Racamier, the perversion. But it is, of course, a blatant, egregious misuse of what we understand when it comes to perversions. Perversion has been defined by Freud, expanded upon by another Frenchman, Lacan, and we have a clear understanding of what it is. Appropriating this word and redefining it in a way that is completely the opposite is not done, is not okay, is not science. It's a mess. And that is exactly what Racamier did. Racamier specified that he's talking about a collective affair, not an individual thing, not an intrapsychic thing. His perversion is about interpersonal relationships, not about the individual, which is peculiar to use the understatement of the century. Perversion is, of course, intrapsychic. It characterizes the individual. We could have collective perversions, naturally, but interpersonal perversion is pretty much a meaningless oxymoron. Okay. Paul-Claude Racamier, as I said, started the whole thing in 1986. And he said that he was brainstorming. He said, I'm not formalizing it, I'm brainstorming, which is very reminiscent of the general attitude of the French intellectual. In 2012, in the aforementioned book, The Genius of Origins, in chapters 9 and 10, he references the theme of narcissistic perversion. And there's a chapter there titled Narcissistic Perversions, multiple. In 1993, he redefined the whole thing this way: a sustainable organization characterized by the ability to protect itself from internal conflicts, and in particular from mourning, grief, by promoting oneself to the detriment of an object, handled such as a utensil or a foil. So here we see the fogginess of Racamier's thinking, because this definition includes both a relational aspect, the object that is mishandled and maltreated by the narcissist, and at the same time definitely includes an intrapsychic organization, an organization that is geared to protect a vulnerable core. So which is it, Racamier? Interpersonal or intrapersonal, intrapsychic? The notion of narcissistic perversion was further elaborated upon by others. Alberto Aiguer in 1989 wrote The Narcissistic Pervert and His Accomplice. He spoke of a particular case of the pathology of narcissism, as if the pervert narcissist is a subspecies of narcissist, the equivalent of, let's say, the covert narcissist. The notion of moral harassment was first described by Marie-France Irigoyen in 1998, and it was based heavily on the narcissistic pervert, and it became very popular. Multiple press articles, interviews, and so on and so forth have taken it up, and everyone involved in the narcissistic perversion movement has reveled in their newfound celebrity and fame and became household names on television screens and so on and so forth. There was no longer the original approach, which insinuated or implied that to be a narcissistic pervert is to experience psychic agony, some pain, huge pain, coupled with a psychotic denial. These disappeared completely, as the narcissist or the pervert narcissist has been increasingly more demonized in the press, in popular media. All the elements that were described by Racamier in 1986, which could have been perceived as mitigating elements, the pain of the narcissist, the agony of the narcissist, the psychosis of the narcissist, all these vanished mysteriously, never to be found again. Between 2008 and 2001 and 2008, there was literally a craze, a fad, a fashion in French media with regards to narcissistic perversion and the pervert narcissist. But these news articles identified the pervert narcissist with a criminal and completely confused it with a psychopath. What in France today passes for the pervert narcissist is just a psychopath or a malignant narcissist. Why there was a need to invent a new name for a well-described phenomenon, well-known, tackled by hundreds of scholars, why there was a need to invent a new name for it, and then completely confuse it with perversion in a totally ignorant manner, I have no idea, and nor does anybody else in the academic scholarly community. Okay, the theme of narcissistic perversion rose again, re-emerged in another article by Racamier in 1978. Racamier mysteriously transitioned to the study of schizophrenia, and he had this to say in an article titled Schizophrenia and Paradoxality. Where we see schizophrenics giving an unprecedented answer to Hamlet's question, we see the pervert narcissist. After all, narcissism was only one perversion among others in Havelock Ellis's inventory before Freud, taking up the word found in the notion, the extensions that transfigured it. If the idea of narcissism comes about paradox, it is not by chance. Now, Racamier was trying to impose his perverted concept of narcissistic perversion on the totality of clinical psychology, implying that everything was just a manifestation of pervert narcissism. For example, schizophrenia. 2 years later, in 1980, Racamier explicitly stated that the notion of narcissistic perversion in chapter 2 of the Schizophrenics of several psychotic constants, where the anti-conflictuality of schizophrenics is opposed to the intra-conflictuality of neurosis. He had this to say: in this report, we will endeavor to show that schizophrenia is organized randomly along the path from acute psychosis to narcissistic perversion. Now, Kernberg and others have strongly advocated the belief, or the perception, the observation, that narcissistic personality disorder is a close kin of psychosis. Again, there was nothing new in Racamier's observations, but his attempt to marry schizophrenia and narcissistic perversion, to put them on a spectrum from acute psychosis to narcissistic perversion, this attempt is highly problematic because the nature of the narcissistic psychosis is diametrically opposed to the nature of classic psychotic disorders. It's exactly a mirror image. For example, whereas the psychotic confuses internal objects with external objects, hyperreflexivity, the narcissist confuses external objects with internal objects. It's a totally different form of confusion. And so we cannot put classical psychosis and narcissism in the same basket, as if there were nothing but a kind of spectrum or continuum. The notion of narcissistic perversion was defined, as I said, in 1986, and there he mentions that narcissistic perversion involves psychic agony, psychotic denial, and other elements. Racamier borrows liberally from Freud's work, even as he castigates Freud, even as he insists that Freud was not a pioneer, and so on and so forth, definitely not in the study of narcissism. He still takes a lot of his work and appropriates it, and then redefines some of the terms in ways which would have astounded Freud and anyone who knows the psychoanalysis. He redefines perversion, and he redefines denial. He specifies any proven psychosis is the fruit of a denial that fails, which is an interesting idea. I'm not going into it right now. Racamier evokes the principle of psychic catastrophe. He says that before one addresses this self-engendering of the psyche around what satisfies it through what he calls the orgasms of the ego, there is a potential for psychic catastrophe. The narcissistic perversion is a part of such a psychic catastrophe. It is the outcome of such a psychic catastrophe. In a way, narcissistic perversion is an attempt to compensate for a psychic catastrophe, to overcome it, to survive it, and to thrive despite it by sacrificing and objectifying other people, by consuming other people. The narcissist actually fends off the psychic catastrophe that gave rise to narcissism in the first place. The psyche, incompletely constructed, hurt by infantile wounds and poor self-esteem, tries to build itself, or at least to calm its pain, through control over others and the pleasures of omnipotence. And this is the orgasm of the narcissist's ego, although of course the narcissist does not possess a full-fledged ego or a self. There's been a disruption in this process. This narcissistic elation, as was described and defined decades before Racamier, this narcissistic elation is indeed a critical part of pathological narcissism, but it is linked to the etiology of narcissism, the shared environment where the narcissist grew up, and in which the narcissist experiences all kinds of breaches of boundaries, violations, abuse, trauma, instrumentalization, objectification, and so on. So yes, of course there is an orgastic element in narcissism, an element of euphoria and elation, a manic element in a way, but it has to do with what Freud called the oceanic feeling, going back to the womb, merging with a maternal figure. The others serve as props in a theater production. They are not consumables, they are not comestibles, they are not raw material. They're actors and actresses in a theater play or a movie, the shared fantasy. To imply that the narcissist uses other people just in order to somehow cover up for the wounds, the early wounds in childhood and so on and so forth, is correct, of course. But the way that Racamier describes it, the consumerist way, where the narcissist is a consumer, is at best only partly true and misses the core aspects and core clinical features of narcissism. Racamier recalls the previous use of this terminology by himself, as well as by Greenacre and Chesgueux and others. And then he defines it. He says, the active propensity of the subject to feed his own narcissism at the expense of that of others. So it's not a sexual perversion, rather a perversity. He explains, its function is twofold. It is a question for the perversive to ensure his own immunity despite conflict and the pains of mourning, and to valorize himself narcissistically in relation to deep and hidden flaws by attacking the other's ego and enjoying his rout. This rout is then imputed to him, which means that the perversive enjoyment is always double. In other words, the narcissist uses the other, and this is a double pleasure. It doubles the pleasure, because not only does the narcissist consume others in order to buttress his grandiosity, his defenses, his protective shell, and so on, but the very fact that he has this power over other people is in itself aggrandizing, in itself elating. Now, many of these things are indisputable and non-contestable, and everyone agrees. But the question is, why does Racamier present all this as if he has just discovered it? As if he is the great innovator, and why does he rename so many things unnecessarily? His writings border on plagiarism, I must say, if not, well over the border. So, Racamier attaches narcissistic perversion to a singular relationship to language, to verbalization. He says, in psychosis, words are overinvested in place of objects. But in narcissistic perversion, it is the word that is overinvested to the detriment of beings. And it is not, as in psychosis, reality that is overinvested, It is the truth. Again, huge confusion. People are objects. The distinction in his work between people and objects is wrong. In psychoanalysis, in object relation schools, everything is an object. Other people are objects, beliefs are objects, ideas are objects, values are objects, memories are objects. Some objects are internal, some objects are external, but they're all objects. There is a single subject, the individual, and this subject apprehends the environment, initially non-verbally and then verbally, by objectifying it, by regarding everything and everyone as an object. The distinction in Racamier's work betrays profound ignorance of the most basic tenets of psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theories, and object relation schools. And he summarizes by saying, to them, to narcissists, a successful lie counts as a truth, ignoring completely that's what he said. And what I'm saying is, he's ignoring completely the role of fantasy, which is shocking, because narcissism, pathological narcissism, is just another name for fantasy. It's a fantasy defense. And to ignore the fantasy and to say that the narcissist is this calculated, cunning, scheming machine is to confuse narcissism with psychopathy and to betray, again, profound ignorance of the whole field and the whole topic. When he says that narcissists lie deliberately, and then when the lie succeeds, they regard it as the truth, implies that the narcissist can tell the difference between fantasy and reality, which the narcissist, by all authorities, cannot. The narcissist cannot tell the difference between reality and fantasy. That's the core and the engine of narcissism. Racamier clarified the notion of narcissistic perversion in additional articles on narcissistic perversion, perverse thought and brainlessness, and others. I will not go into it right now. I mentioned Alberto Aguirre in 1989, who used the notion of narcissistic perversion to describe the narcissistic pervert and his accomplice in an eponymous book. He quotes Racamier, but he takes it in a totally different direction. The narcissistic perversion in Aguirre's work is not relational or interpersonal. It's intrapsychic. It belongs to the individual. It's an organizational principle of the personality. He describes a personality in his work, whereas Racamier confined himself to explaining a mechanism which is at work in relationships. He talked about movement from to. In a 1992 article, Aguirre explains, I speak in the singular. We should speak in the plural. This is because narcissistic perversion, this is Racamier, yes? I speak in the singular. We should speak in the plural. This is because narcissistic perversion is far from being an individual affair. It is a collective affair. And from the moment that psychic spaces are transgressed, we know that all excesses are possible. Similarly, the perverse movement is far from being an intrapsychic affair. It's a highly interactive case, for it is so much, this movement, turned towards others that it does not cease to use it. So here there's a big disagreement between the adherents of the narcissistic perversion movement, who are trying somehow to drag it back to the roots and origins and the canonical texts of psychoanalysis. And by doing so, they're simply relabeling narcissistic personality disorder. They are rediscovering or reinventing Heinz Kohut's work, Otto Kernberg's work, and object relation schools. when you reduce narcissistic perversion to the individual level, when it's merely an intrapsychic disorder, then why call it narcissistic perversion? Why not call it narcissistic personality disorder? Why the need for a new name? According to Gerard Bayle, Racamier does not seek to qualify individuals, but to identify the origin of a dysfunction in interactions. In other words, Racamier was not concerned with diagnosis. He was concerned with capturing the essence of the narcissistic interaction with other people. What Racamier was concerned with is the pathology, the perversion of the relationships, the interpersonal relationships of the narcissist. How the narcissist perverts relationships with others by objectifying them, consuming them, and using them for internal regulation. All this, again, is a consensus. No one would disagree with any of this. The question arises, therefore, why the need to restate it as if you have just discovered the will? The will, yeah? Okay. Gerard Bayle tried to kind of advocate for Racamier. He says that the notion of narcissistic perversion serves his concern to describe and track down perverse processes in families and groups. Even if we were to accept this, the word perversion is misleading, ignorant, and all around wrong, completely, unmitigatedly, inexcusably, as I will discuss in a minute. Racamier specified, there is nothing to expect from the association of narcissistic perverts. One can only hope to come out of it unscathed. Da. Racamier's work was merely a re-encapsulation and rediscovery or reinvention of work that had been done throughout the decades that preceded Racamier. I read his book and his articles, and I couldn't find anything new. He's great at capturing the dynamics, he's very empathetic, he has a way with language, he writes well, but he is not an innovator. On the very contrary, he muddied the waters, he created a muddle, made a huge mess, and he retarded clinical psychology in France when it comes to narcissistic pathologies. He retarded it by 2-3 decades. Not the least was his misuse of the word perversion, misapplication. So, I would like now to discuss the very concept of perversion, in classical literature, in basic ideas in psychoanalysis and so on, so that we can begin to see where Racamier got it wrong. But before I go there, I would like to mention a few reactions of supporters of Racamier, people who thought his work was innovative and contributed to psychology. Marie-France Irigoyen, which I mentioned earlier, she's a theorist and she popularized the concept. And she said that she regretted the popular success of this expression because it now designates all kinds of extroverted people. According to her, this pathology remains much more rare than we think. There are many criticisms of Racamier's work and principle. Claude Nachand, in 1996, had this to say. At the end of his report, Gerard Bayle points out, after the bans, the polymorphous perverse character of human sexuality and differentiates it from perversity. His description of the perverted trio and the narcissistic pervert leaves me with a feeling of uneasiness. And I prefer Harold Searle's position, describing the unconscious effort to drive the other crazy. I prefer this to the inflation of the notion of narcissistic pervert with the formidable confusions that it can arouse in the minds of patients and families who read our texts. Well said. He continues, even if there are intermediate cases, it seems important to me to distinguish between those who consciously, voluntarily, and deliberately implement activities likely to procure them strong pleasures to the detriment of others, to distinguish this kind of people from people who are placed in the unconscious psychic necessity of violating the fundamental laws without being able to explain it, even to themselves, reduced as they are to inventing a story of their misfortunes under pressures from others. This story is, of course, the fantasy. Excellent, excellently put. Marcel Sangueux said that the concept of narcissistic pervert is an invention, and it is the equivalent of hysteria in the 19th century, and I couldn't agree more. According to Sangueux, this concept is limited to France only, no one else uses it, is highly overused, and completely wrong. In a minute, when I deal with the issue of what is perversion, you will see why. The meaning of the concept of narcissistic personality disorder, especially the malignant narcissist, is very close to the concept of narcissistic perversion. The narcissistic psychopath or the psychopathic narcissist. There was no need for this new additional derivative construct of narcissistic perversion. Okay, so what is, after all, what is perversion? What is narcissistic perversion in the clinical sense? How do we identify it clinically according to the School of Narcissistic Perversion in France? What do they have to say? Let me read to you a list compiled by Isabelle Nazaraga. She's a behavioral and cognitive therapist. And she says that there are 30 characteristic behaviors. And if you meet 14 of them, 1-4, then you're probably a narcissistic pervert. You have been warned. And here they are. Number 1, the person makes others feel guilty by invoking love, friendship, family, and professional conscience. Number 2, it requires perfection from others, that they must be omniscient, totally available to him or her, and this immediately, capable of answering all questions, and that they must never change their minds. Number 3, he exploits the moral feelings of others, duty, generosity, courtesy, humanism, to satisfy his needs. Number 4, questions the competence, personality, and qualities of others, characterizes and devalues in order to create disarray, and afterwards judges. Number 5, jealous of everyone, including own family. Number 6, has recourse to flattery, gifts, and services rendered to make herself or himself look good. Number 7, constantly poses as a victim. Number 8, never considers herself or himself responsible for anything, thus making others responsible for everything. Number 9, does not clearly state its feelings, opinions, needs, and demands. Number 10, always answers evasively. Number 11, can change the subject without transition during a conversation. 12, avoids or leaves meetings and interviews. 13, uses indirect means, such as others, telephone answering machines, or written messages to get his message across. Number 14, invokes logical reasons for passing its request for control. Number 15, distorts, interprets, and tells lies to hide or discover the truth. Number 16, refuses criticism and denies the obvious. 17, sometimes resorts to blackmail and implicit threats. 18, it creates conflicts in order to manipulate others around him. Number 19, behaves differently and modifies the expression of his thought according to people and situations. 20, lies, including by omission. 21, uses the ignorance of counterparts, tries to make people admit that he or she is superior to them. 22, is self-centered. 23, what he or she says does not correspond to what he or she does. Number 24, invokes urgency to obtain an advantage from others. Number 25, denies the feelings, desires, needs, and rights of others. Number 26, implicitly rejects the requests by pretending to deal with them. Number 20, that's a kind of passive aggression. Number 27, generates feelings of unease, helplessness, and or lack of freedom. Number 28, succeeds in making others perform unwanted acts. Number 29, achieves its objectives at the expense of others. Number 30, is the subject of frequent and recurrent discussions. So, 14 of these 30 qualify you as a narcissistic pervert. And she says that a narcissist within the couple, for example, would try to isolate his spouse and try to destroy the spouse's self-confidence in order to better manipulate the spouse, even if it means destroying her or him. Now, this list of 30 attributes is a complete mix-up between psychopath and narcissist, which is the inevitable outcome of the very construct of narcissistic perversion, because narcissistic perversion focuses on relationships, not on internal psychodynamics, not on intrapsychic structures. Okay, so what's wrong? What's wrong with the use of the word perversion? Where did he get it wrong? Where did he? What's the mistake there? Perversion is a very old term. Sigmund Freud defined perversion as a sexual behavior that deviates from the norm, abnormal, not normative, sexual behavior. The norm in Freud's time, 19th century Vienna, was heterosexual genital intercourse. Anything that deviated from that was perversion. That's how it started. But gradually, this definition became problematic as homosexuality, BDSM, oral sex became very common, widely discussed practices and widely practiced. So there was a need to redefine perversity or perversion. And Freud himself, already in his work, suggested that perversity is polymorphous. It has many forms. Human sexuality has many forms, he said, is polymorphous. And there is a difficulty, he said, to impose some kind of pre-given natural order on human sexuality. The absence of naturality, the absence of the way of nature, doesn't mean that it's a perversion. So, as usual, Freud contradicted himself, which he did extremely frequently throughout his career. And so we have two versions of Freud's perversion. One type of perversion, one definition of perversion is any sexual act that deviates from heterosexual genital intercourse. And another definition of perversity or perversion is a lot more amorphous, a lot more ephemeral and in flux, by saying that human sexual nature is polymorphous. So this created a huge mess in psychoanalysis. And Jacques Lacan, a Frenchman, suggested that perversion is any situation where you convert yourself into the sexual object of another person. Othering became a way of self-objectification and self-instrumentalization. The recognition of the other's gaze, the other's desire, the other's urges, the other's sex drive, render you an object to be consumed by the other. It's a form of autoerotism, ironically, because by considering yourself sexually desirable in the eyes of others, you also find yourself sexually desirable. And of course, autoerotism is a kind of perversion, very common among narcissists. Lacan said the following: what is perversion? It is not simply an aberration in relation to social criteria, not an anomaly contrary to good morals, although this register is not absent, of course, should be taken into account. Nor is it an atypicality according to natural criteria, said Lacan, namely that it more or less derogates from the reproductive finality of the sexual union. It is something else in its very structure. And he made a distinction between perverse acts and perverse structure. There are certain sexual acts which are closely associated with perverse structures, psychological structures. But it's possible to engage in these acts and not be a pervert. So these acts can be practiced by non-perverse subjects, people, and by perverse people. So in other words, it's not possible by observing certain sexual acts to tell whether the person is a pervert or not a pervert. And Freud's approach to perversion implies some kind of universalist position, a universalist morality, or at least social morality. Social disapproval, the infraction of good morals, determine whether a particular act is perverse or not. And Lacan said that's wrong, because acts could be abnormal, could be non-normative, could be rejected by society, and still not constitute any proof of the existence of internal psychological perversion. So we need to focus, Lacan said, we need to focus on the perverse structure, because the perverse structure remains perverse even when the acts associated with it are socially approved. In Lacan's formulation, it is the neurotic subject who is in conflict with authority, the law, words, language, and so on. The perverse subject, on the other hand, knows very well the words, the language, the letter of the law, is fluent with conventions and rules and norms and behaviors that are socially acceptable and condoned, and knows everything, knows what other people desire, is fully cognizant of everything, but the perverse structure follows the law to the letter in a kind of passive-aggressive way, follows the negative aspects of authority, the dictum not to not enjoy. So it's in a way a bit masochistic. According to Jean Clavreul, as far as the pervert is concerned, there's a conflict between desire and law, and it is resolved by making desire the law of the pervert acts. Lacan, for example, regarded homosexuality as a perversion when it is practiced in certain ways. And he gave examples of ancient Greece and so on. I will not go into it. But it's not because homosexuality or any other form of sexuality is perverse in itself. It's not a statistical definition. The perverse nature of homosexuality is entirely a question of infringement on the normative requirements of internal structures, such as the Oedipus complex. And so Lacan disagreed with Freud, and both of them catastrophically disagree with Racamier, who appropriated this word, stole it from Freud and Lacan and others, and defined it in a way that has nothing to do with its original meaning. We are not allowed to do this. I can't take the word energy, borrow it from physics, and within physics define it differently. I can't do that. Energy is energy and is energy, period, within physics. I can take the word energy out of physics and imbue it with a new lexical definition and a new meaning. But within physics, I have to use it the way that it has been defined originally and the way that reflects the consensus of the profession. And Racamier flouted these rules. Lacan criticized Freud. He said that Freud forgot the importance of heterosexuality in the Oedipal myth, as a kind of normative behavior. In other words, what Lacan said, the heterosexual aspect of the Oedipus complex, the child is attracted to the opposite sex parent, this has nothing to do with nature. This has to do with social norms. And while this is highly debatable, it's an interesting take. There are two main ways in which Lacan characterized the perverse structure and distinguish it from ostensibly perverse acts. So the first way is what he called disavowal. Perversion is distinguished from other clinical features by the operation of disavowal. The pervert disavows things. In Freud's work, disavows castration, never mind. But there is a disavowal here. There is a rejection of something. Perversion is about antagonism, and that's why it sits well with some narcissistic defenses. But narcissism is not mainly about rejection, not mainly about conflict and antagonism. Narcissism is mainly about fantasy. There are other critical features of narcissism. Perversion is probably a fringe phenomenon, if it exists at all. And this disavowal is a critical feature. There's a problematic relation to one's own body in Lacan's work. He uses the classical psychoanalytic vocabulary of phallus and phallic, and forget all this. What he's saying is that there is a problem in the intra-relationship between the individual and his body. There are parts missing. There are parts which are superfluous or surplus. There is a conflicted interaction with the body, self-perception of the body, proprioception. There's something is wrong with the way the body is perceived. And the perversion is reperceiving or reconceiving of the body through someone else's gaze. Someone else's gaze redefines the body, renders it sexually attractive to others and to oneself via autoerotism. That's the core of perversion, according to Lacan. It's not that far from Freud, actually, although Lacan would bristle at this suggestion. Freud also discussed all these issues. What Freud's mistake has been is to ground all his conversation, all his discourse, in the morality of 19th century Vienna, a Victorian morality, kind of. But otherwise, Freud was right in many ways. Lacan said, the whole problem of perversions consists in conceiving how the child, in his relation to the mother, identifies himself with the imaginary object of her desire. It's the mother's gaze that is the first to raise self-awareness in the child as a sexual object. The child sexualizes itself via the mother's gaze. The mother desires the child in some way. It's not entirely sexual, but it is erotic to a large degree. And it is this autoerotism stolen from the mother, self-imputed, that remains for life in pathologies like narcissistic personality pathologies. And so perversion is a particular way in which the subject situates himself in relation to this drive, this particular drive, the sex drive. In perversion, the subject locates himself as object of the drive, as the means of the other's jouissance, the other's kind of vividness, the other's gaze, the other's desire, the other's life force. When you position yourself as someone else's object, as the target and the repository of someone else's attentions and intentions and wishes and dreams, then you become auto-erotized. You become a sexual object to others and to yourself. And this is to invert the structure of fantasy, and which is why the formula for perversion appears in his work as the opposite of fantasy. But I propose that the narcissist uses fantasy to convert himself into the object of the drive of others. The shared fantasy of the narcissist converts the narcissist, renders the narcissist a repository of other people's affects. For example, admiration and adulation of other people's sex drive. So the narcissist regards himself or experiences himself as irresistibly attractive via the gaze of others. In this sense, the narcissist self-objectifies within a fantasy, and his self-objectification amounts to perversion according to Lacan, but not according to Racamier. In Racamier, the locus of the perversion is the relationship itself. The fact that the narcissist exploits and abuses other people is the perversion. But of course, it's a wrong use of the word perversion. The correct word is abuse. With Lacan's work and Freud's work and similar scholars and thinkers, the perversion is in the way one perceives oneself, one experiences oneself with the aid of other people, through other people's gaze, through other people's agency, and in their presence, within a shared fantastic space. The pervert assumes the position of the object instrument of what Lacan called the will to enjoy, volonté de jouissance, which is not his own will, but the will of others, or what Lacan called the big other. The pervert does not pursue his activity for his own pleasure, but for the enjoyment of others. It is his capacity to cause others to enjoy. It is his power to give them joy, to induce in them pleasure, that render the narcissist omnipotent. When the narcissist converts himself into an object of enjoyment and pleasure, and then changes other people, forces them to desire him, forces them to admire and adulate him, forces them to have sex with him, not forces, but like kind of brings them to have sex with him, induces them, this power to change the inner psychodynamics of other people. This is the omnipotence in the shared fantasy. The changes that narcissists create in other people, the transformations they engender in other people, are proof positive of the narcissist's godlike powers. Narcissism is indeed, as Racamier suggests, derivatively, not originally, narcissism is indeed about using other people, but not in the ways that Racamier postulates. Racamier's perception is very superficial and very, very populist, very, media hype. The narcissist is bad, he's a demon, he's evil, he's abusing people, he's using them. That's a perversion. I would have expected this from some self-styled expert online, not from someone who claims to be a deep thinker and a great psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. That's not the key issue in narcissism by far. The narcissist does use other people, of course, but he uses other people to construct himself. He uses other people to experience himself as an irresistible sexual object. He uses other people to feel that he exists. He uses other people to become. He uses other people to buttress his grandiosity. He uses other people to share his fantasy. Yes, he uses other people. And of course, these people pay a dear price for having been objectified and having been abused. And it's all true. But the narcissist's goal and aim is not to abuse people. That's a psychopath. And that's the huge confusion of Racamier. He confuses narcissists with psychopaths. He is, for lack of a better moniker, He's a self-styled expert. As simple as that. So there are many types of perversions. Many of them have nothing to do with narcissism, of course. For example, sadism, masochism, where the subject locates himself or herself as the object of an invocatory drive. The pervert is the person in whom the structure of the drive is most clearly revealed. It's a kind of transparent person. It's a person who carries the attempt to go beyond the pleasure principle to the limit. He who goes, as Lacan said, he who goes as far as he can along the path of enjoyment, jouissance. Freud said that neuroses are the negative of perversions. They are the opposite of perversions. And there have been quite a few attempts to exegetically enter Freud's mind and understand what did he mean, honestly. And some people say that he meant that perversion is simply the direct expression of a natural instinct, while in neurosis, the natural instinct is repressed. In the pervert, it is expressed. But Lacan rejects this interpretation completely. He says the drive is not to be conceived of as a natural instinct. He says drives are not necessarily natural, and they don't always get discharged in a direct way. And there's no 0 degree of satisfaction, he said. Secondly, the pervert's relation to the drive is just as complex and elaborated as that of the neurotic. While there's no repression, there is expression. The expression is mediated via complex psychodynamics and psychological constructs. And is expressed, the drive is expressed for it's a means to an end. The end could be, for example, a fantasy in narcissism, but it's an intermediary phase. The pleasure, the enjoyment, everything, there are inducements, there are incentives to externalize the drive and express it, but all this is at the service of a larger narrative. In narcissism, the fantasy. In sadism and masochism, the pain, the narrative of pain. From the point of view of genetic development, neurosis and perversion are therefore the same. Perversion presents the same, I'm quoting, presents the same dimensional richness as a neurosis, the same abundance, the same rhythms, and the same stages. It's therefore necessary to interpret Freud's remark in another way. Perversion is structured in an inverse way to neurosis, but is equally structured. So you see that you cannot just take the word perversion, as Racamier has done, and say perversion is everything that is socially unacceptable, is abuse, is trauma, maybe criminal behavior, and narcissists do it. That's why narcissists are pervert. And narcissistic perversion is about the way the narcissist relates to other people by abusing them. That's cool on a YouTube channel, a beginner self-styled expert. That is seriously not serious in a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist. The depth of pathological narcissism is immense. Many scholars thought that pathological narcissism is the most complex psychological phenomenon ever. And I fully tend to agree, having spent 30 years studying it and still learning new things every day. Racamier's work is reductive, redundant, and ignorant. And it is a great tragedy for clinical psychology in France that it is trapped in concepts and schools and ideas which are by today counterfactual, and that it gives rise and then embraces derivative ignorant work like Racamier's narcissistic perversion. There have been many scholars in France who have dealt with narcissistic perversion, and it is linked to some extent to the concept of anti-narcissism, Francis Pachet's anti-narcissism. He explains that In the narcissistic perversion described by Racamier, the anti-narcissistic dimension has become inapparent. It has disappeared. But the narcissistic pervert nevertheless needs others as utensils to escape his internal conflictuality. This is one example of enormous confusion caused by Racamier. And the word perversion is so resonant that it created confusion in the minds of numerous psychoanalysts and scholars and so on and so forth. Marie-Claude Defort, Dominique France Thiebailly, Serge Resnick, all these, they, for example, are trying to reconcile Racamier with Freud. And I will not go into everything that Racamier had, all the turbulence that Racamier's concept has created and retarded the study of narcissism in France irredeemably almost. Jean Bergeret distinguishes a perversion of character from a perversion of everyone is trying to square the circle, you know. He says the perversion of character is a person whose objective is to deny the other the possibility of feeling one's own interests in order to feed one's own of sexual perversion, whose aim is to impose one's sexual impulses and fantasies on others. So I can go further and further and further into this issue. But I think I gave you an overview of Racamier's work and why he, to my mind, embodies everything that's wrong in the way scholars, academics, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, and experts, especially self-imputed experts, just go back in the literature, find something, call it a new name, seem to redefine it, and ride the wave of fame and celebrity into the horizon. Today, I would say that 80–90% of the work in psychology is rebranding, renaming, rediscovering, reinvention, derivative, redundant, nothing new. 80–90% easily. And it's a stagnant pool. And it's a sorry state. And Racamier is just a symptom.